All right, well, we're nearing about 40 people in here right now, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasper Bors, and I'm the student president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. Also online is our engagement director, Matisse Baton, who will be co-moderating this event alongside me. I'm excited to welcome all of you to our debate on America and NATO. Before we introduce our guests this afternoon, I want to say a quick word about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2010. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the cultivation and creation of new knowledge is the goal, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. I'd also like to recognize the American Enterprise Institute Executive Council program for their gracious sponsorship of this event. The Executive Council, the AEI Executive Council at Yale works to advance campus dialogue about public policy and introduce students and faculty to the scholarship of the American Enterprise Institute. AEI is a Washington-based, nonpartisan research think tank committed to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world through rigorous public policy scholarship. AEI also believes in the importance of a robust competition of ideas and aims to promote civil discourse on campus and across the country. Now I'll let Matisse introduce our guests.
Emma Ashford is a resident senior fellow with the New American Engagement Initiative in the Snowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, which focuses upon challenging the prevailing assumptions governing US foreign policy and seeks to develop effective solutions that preserve America's security and prosperity. Her work focuses upon questions of grand strategy, international security, and the future of US foreign policy. She has expertise in the politics of Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. Previously, she was a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute, where she worked on a variety of issues, including the US-Saudi relationship, the usage and efficacy of sanctions, US policy towards Russia, conflicts in Syria and Ukraine, and US foreign policy and grand strategy more broadly. She also founded and co-hosted the Power Problems podcast. Her long-form writing has been featured in publications such as Foreign Affairs, the Texas National Security Review, and Strategic Studies Quarterly. Her opinion writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the National Interest, among others. Ashford writes a bi-weekly column, It's Debatable, for Foreign Policy, and is a regular contributor to Instinct. She's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and holds a PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Hal Brands is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies US foreign policy and defense strategy. Concurrently, Dr. Brands is the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Dr. Brands has previously worked as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning and a lead writer for the National Defense Strategy Commission. Dr. Brands is the author, co-author, or editor of several books, including The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and World Order, American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump, and Making the Unipolar Moment, US Foreign Policy and the Rise of Post-Cold War Order. In addition to his regular Bloomberg column, Dr. Brands has been widely published and interviewed in the popular print and broadcast media. His work has been published in Commentary, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Security, The American Interest, The National Interest, The Washington Quarterly, The Weekly Standard, and other policy and academic journals. Dr. Brands graduated from Yale with a PhD, MA, and MPhil in history. He also received a BA in history and political science from Stanford University. About the format of today's debate. We'll have each of our guests start with 5-minute opening statements, after which both speakers will have 2 minutes each to respond. We'll then move into questions from Jasper and myself and questions from you, our audience, which you can submit throughout the event using the Q&A feature on the lower panel of the Zoom window. With that, I'd like to ask Dr. Brands to begin.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having us here for this discussion. It's a lot of fun to be here with Emma, whose column I enjoy reading every time it's out. It's a great opportunity for a back and forth with her on this issue. And so just to dive right into it, I think my burden here is to argue that the U.S. should support and continue participating in NATO, and I'm happy to do that. I think NATO is an institution that is frustrating, it's often problematic, and it is utterly indispensable. It's frustrating in the sense that NATO has always faced challenges. The United States has been complaining about free-riding allies since about 15 minutes after the Washington Treaty was signed in 1949. The allies have been complaining that the US acts unilaterally and irresponsibly for just about as long, but the alliance has held together for over 70 years now because it is indispensable. During the Cold War, only NATO could protect America's interest in a stable, friendly Europe by making that continent safe from its enemies and also safe from its own internal demons. And what NATO accomplished during the Cold War was not simply preventing the Soviets from coercing or intimidating the free world, as crucial as that was. It also provided the climate of reassurance that allowed former enemies like France and West Germany to work together to cooperate for regional economic development and thus to turn Europe into the zone of relative peace that we know today. This was a fundamental historic accomplishment for Europe, obviously, but also for the United States, which has an interest in a stable, friendly Europe because it had been drawn into European wars twice in the 20th century. Now, obviously, the situation has changed a great deal since the Cold War, but one of the reasons the situation has changed is because of the historic accomplishments of NATO and the US role in it. And in fact, NATO still delivers massive benefits to the United States. And so let me just name a few. So first, NATO deters aggression in Europe by laying down red lines that no aggressor has proven willing to violate. It's not a coincidence that Vladimir Putin has attacked countries that don't have NATO guarantees, like Georgia and Ukraine, but not those that do, like Estonia or Poland. And so NATO effectively keeps the dividing line in the US-Russia competition as far to the east as possible, rather than having it in Central Europe where it was during the Cold War. So NATO makes the strategic status quo, which is enormously favorable to America, stickier than it might otherwise be. Second, NATO keeps a lid on dangerous phenomena like nuclear proliferation because it gives countries like Germany and Poland, countries that you might suspect would develop nuclear weapons otherwise, security guarantees that allow them to forego possession of the absolute weapon. NATO doesn't have a perfect record on this issue, but it's got a really good one. Third, NATO tamps down instability in Europe. It creates a cocoon of security ties that allow countries that once ripped each other to shreds, so Poland and Germany, Germany and France, France and Italy, to cooperate economically, politically, and militarily instead. Fourth, NATO binds many of the richest and most dynamic countries in the world to Washington through relationships of deep cooperation. If you want to know why the United States was able to prevent the Europeans from, say, selling advanced weaponry to China back in the George W. Bush years, or to dissuade so many European countries from adopting Chinese 5G tech more recently, part of it is because our leading role in NATO gives us so much diplomatic leverage, not perfect diplomatic leverage, but more than we would enjoy otherwise with these countries. And so NATO thus gives us a far greater overbalance of power vis-a-vis American rivals than we would otherwise enjoy. Fifth, NATO provides intelligence benefits. It helps us on issues from China to counterterrorism to Russia. Some of the most important international intelligence liaison relationships the United States has are with NATO allies. Sixth, NATO provides added military punching power. The United States can bring more power to bear on a variety of problems, whether deterring Russia, operating in the Middle East, or whatever, because of the capabilities its allies bring to the table. We've never gotten as much out of the allies as we might like, but it still gives the United States the ability to actually punch above its own weight in international affairs. Seventh, NATO gives us the ability to cooperate on issues beyond those related to traditional military defense. We've used NATO extensively as a vehicle for counterterrorism cooperation over the last 20 years. We're using it as a forum to deal with emerging challenges like cyber aggression and information warfare today. NATO is an incredibly adaptable institution. It promotes patterns of cooperation that can be used for a wide range of purposes. And finally, NATO is a net economic plus for the United States. We've all heard critiques about how much it costs to station U.S. forces abroad, but there's a lot of scholarship showing that the U.S. enjoys more trade with NATO allies than it does with non-allied countries, and that commitments to NATO make European countries more likely to do things like support the dollar as a primary global reserve currency. Now, some of these benefits would be less impressive if you believed that the United States either did not have an interest in a stable, secure Europe, or if you thought that outcome could be achieved without such impressive US involvement. That, however, has not historically been the case, which is why NATO was created in the first place. And I don't think it's the case today. So just to sum up, are there challenges that the alliance faces? Are there divisions within it that need to be addressed? Absolutely. Can we do without it? I'd say absolutely not.
Thank you, Dr. Brands. Dr. Ashford, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me tonight and for hosting such an interesting debate. I guess I'm coming to this debate as more of a critic of NATO, certainly, than Hal is on these topics. But I'm going to open here by saying that NATO is important. And perhaps more importantly than that, the transatlantic relationship is important. It is important for historical reasons. It's important for cultural reasons. I myself am a dual citizen of the UK and the US, so I can tell you that there are very, very strong historical ties between the US and Europe. And I think that those matter. And I think that to the extent that the US sees its future as part of a community of states, Europe is the logical place to start with that. However, I'm also going to talk a little about some of the problems that we have with NATO today, and why I think perhaps the best way for the US to approach NATO is not to simply double down and keep doing what we've always done, but to think about ways that we can modify that relationship to make it more stable and more fruitful over the long term. And perhaps most notably, to get the most out of it that all parties to that agreement can actually get out of it. So, first point, I mean, Hal was very upfront when he very clearly said, NATO today isn't NATO during the Cold War. Russia today isn't the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And I think that's one of the arguments that very frequently gets made here. And it's true. There is substantially less threat from Russia to Europe than there was from the Soviet Union to Europe. If you think about the threats that we talk about from Russia today, they're either threats below the level of armed conflict, so they're things like election hacking or murdering dissidents, which are serious problems, but are not about conquering Europe. Or they are military threats that are far smaller than they were during the Soviet era. So we're not talking about Soviet tanks rolling into Western Germany here. We're talking about border disputes in Georgia and Ukraine, or potentially on the border of NATO allies. So Russia today isn't the Soviet Union. It isn't the ideological threat that the Soviet Union was, and it isn't the same threat that the Soviet Union was ideologically. NATO today, however, is also not the NATO of the Cold War, and the post-Cold War evolution of NATO has actually been largely obscured by this narrative that the US has always supported NATO. We created NATO. It won the Cold War. It's the same organization it always has been, and that's not entirely true. During the post-Cold War period, defense planners in the US and in Europe basically saw the reality that we just talked about, the reality that Russia, particularly during the 1990s, but even today, isn't the Soviet Union. And they started to cast around and look for new missions for NATO. So unlike some realists would have predicted, NATO didn't simply wither away. Instead, NATO, rather like the March of Dimes here in the US, a charity that switched once polio had been eradicated to talking about other childhood diseases, NATO switched when the Soviet Union collapsed to discussion of other missions. So first of all, NATO expanded substantially. And there was a lot of talk about using NATO expansion as a vehicle with which to stabilize Central and Eastern Europe, and then to bring states in Central and Eastern Europe into the sort of democratic and economic fold of the European Union. Though it was never explicitly stated, NATO membership was seen as the first step on the road to European Union membership. And then NATO also reoriented itself towards what were called out-of-area missions. So the idea that NATO could be of service in UN peacekeeping missions, in pushing back on human rights abuses in various places. And we see this starting during the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, but continuing all the way through NATO's involvement in the Libya conflict in the early part of this decade. And those two shifts within NATO's mission ended up, in my opinion at least, weakening the alliance because they switched the way the alliance was approaching the Russia problem to capabilities that aren't necessarily best suited for dealing with Russia. And so in 2014, when Russia seized Crimea and started to pose more of a threat, particularly in eastern Ukraine, the alliance was left flat-footed with regard to actually defending against Russia. And then perhaps the bigger problem, and this is the one that people more often talk about, is that NATO expansion has left the alliance very large, very unwieldy, much more differences of opinion inside, and also has left it fairly weak in terms of public opinion and public support for the alliance and for its mission. So NATO today is not the NATO that it was at the end of the Cold War, and we need to acknowledge that. The other problem is that NATO's relationship with the US is very unbalanced today. So you'll often hear people, including Donald Trump in the last 4 years, talk about how the US pays the most for NATO. And while that's not perhaps technically true in very technical, narrow terms, it is true in the absolute fact of the statement. European members of NATO have a larger population and a bigger GDP than the United States, but the US still pays about 70% of the total defense spending of all NATO members. And while there's been some improvement in recent years, I think we went from 4 members of NATO hitting the 2% of GDP spending mark just a few years back, and now it's 10 members of NATO hitting that mark in 2020, that's still a fairly small improvement. And a lot of the member states that we're talking about are very small. So this relationship is very, very unbalanced today. And then we have the additional problems of, what you might call threats from inside the house. So states like Turkey or Hungary that, in addition to being authoritarian, which isn't necessarily a problem for NATO given its actual history, but are also willing to deal with countries like Russia to buy Russian weapons systems, and again, pose problems for alliance unity and cohesion. So NATO is in a place where it is difficult for it to carry out either its original mission or, frankly, any of the set of new missions that it has built for itself over the last 3 decades. And I would argue that that leaves the United States with a range of options, but none of them are very good. So, the first is to withdraw totally. And this is what some realists, including some people I consider friends and mentors, argue. I don't entirely agree with that because I think it leaves the US detached from European defense, doesn't give us a say on the continent, and potentially could be dangerous for US security down the road. But most of the other options aren't very good either. The US could lean in, spending more trying to deter Russia. And that's the argument that you hear from some in DC, but again, not very popular, strategically not particularly sustainable, particularly in the context of the US pivoting towards China. We could muddle along, and I suspect that is the strategy that Hal is suggesting here, that we sort of just keep going the way things have been, and it will probably be fine. And that's mostly true, but I would argue that that's not a very good response to internal problems within the organization. We could consider downsizing NATO, but that's very difficult because there's no legal mechanisms to do so. And so that leaves me with basically the final, the one final option that I can consider, I think is the way that the US should relate to NATO, which is to consider downsizing the US role in the organization over time. So remove US troops from Europe over a period of time that allows European allies to ramp up their spending. And that does give us somewhat less control over the organization and somewhat less control over how Europeans think about security. But it has a number of benefits, right? It maintains some ties to the continent. It allows us to come back in a crisis. It provides for America to be effectively the guarantor of last resort of European security, rather than it is right now, which is guarantor of first resort. And I would argue that perhaps most importantly, downsizing the US role in NATO allows us to fully utilize the resources of that bloc. There are many very rich countries in Europe and elsewhere in NATO that aren't fully contributing to their own defense or to the collective defense of us all. And until we rectify that, we are basically leaving resources on the table, and the US is spending resources that it doesn't have to spend in order to keep this organization afloat. So I think I've gone over my time a little, but I will stop there and turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Ashford. Dr. Brands, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, I'll just go very, very briefly here and make a couple of comments. And so I think Emma and I would actually agree with respect to identifying a number of the challenges that confront NATO today, everything from illiberalism within the ranks to the fact that NATO's strategic geography leads to differential threat perceptions among members. And maybe we can talk about what some of the approaches would be to that. But I want to make four quick points. And so the first is that I have a more positive view of NATO's post-Cold War record because I think that the Balkan interventions of the 1990s were actually crucial in preventing the instability there from spreading more widely in Europe. And NATO, in some cases, kind of on an a la carte basis, and in some cases as an alliance, got there late, but played a critical role in extinguishing those things. I think that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe was a prudent hedge against the possibility of an assertive Russia. There's sometimes argued that NATO expansion caused an assertive Russia, but I think that hinges on a counterfactual that Russia would not have behaved in a domineering way toward its neighbors absent NATO expansion. And I don't see a lot of evidence in Russian history to suggest that that's the case. And so when you look back at what realist scholars like John Mearsheimer were predicting about what would happen to Central and Eastern Europe after the Cold War ended in 1990, they were predicting kind of this, anarchic hellscape with, widespread nuclear proliferation, high tensions between Germany and Poland and Russia, and so on and so forth. And while it hasn't all been, peachy, it's been relatively benign compared to that over the past 25 years. And I think NATO expansion has a lot to do with that. An additional point, I'm hard pressed to identify a problem the United States faces strategically that would be easier to deal with without NATO. And I know that Emma is not advocating that we disband NATO, and so I'm not characterizing her position here. But whether it's China or Russia or counterterrorism, I can't think of an issue that becomes easier once NATO goes away, basically. Then the last point I'll make is that I think there is an implicit assumption in the argument that the United States should decrease its commitment to NATO, which we should test. And that assumption is that if we pull back from Europe, our current allies will continue to behave more or less, they will behave as more or less as we would like them to behave in terms of dealing with threats that we identify in ways that we find appropriate. That may be true, but it may also not be true, right? And so if you have less of a US commitment to Europe, are we sure that Germany and France would approach the Russia problem in the same way that they approach it today? Are we sure that they would approach other challenges in the way that we would like them to? My guess is that that's an uncertain proposition at best. And so that's why I'm more inclined to continuing the commitment, facing up to the challenges that the alliance confronts and doing the best we can while recognizing that there is a certain amount of muddling through going on. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Ashford, if you'd like to respond, and then we'll move into questions.
Yeah, sure. So I guess just a couple of quick points. On the question of stability in Europe, I think you can make a very good case that NATO expansion helped to stabilize Eastern Europe. The problem, I think, is the side effects of that. Did it prompt a response from Russia? Did it encourage sort of alliance non-cohesion? And then even if you put that argument to the side, I think there's an argument to be made going forward that NATO has served its purpose in that area, right? Many of these states are now members of the European Union. Many are deeply tied to their neighbors through the European neighborhood policy. If the US pulls back from NATO, or even if NATO were to dissolve tomorrow, those bonds would not disappear. And I think the same goes for that really old argument about, the French and the Germans going at one another, if NATO were to collapse. Again, perhaps it would have been true in the 50s. It's not clear to me that it is true today. On the question of Russia, I agree with you that this is inherently a counterfactual. We will never know how Russia would have reacted in a world where NATO didn't expand. But I think we do have to consider both that policymakers broke their word to the Russians about NATO expansion. There's a really thorough scholarship on this, on implicit and explicit promises that were made about NATO not expanding. And then perhaps more importantly, from my point of view, the Russians were The Russians in the 1990s, at the early 1990s, expected to in some ways be included in European security architecture going forward as a player. And NATO expansion effectively removed that. It expanded the borders of NATO up to Russia and excluded Russia from the European security community, leaving it off on its own to the side. And so while I agree that it's a counterfactual, it's not clear to me that we couldn't have had somewhat of a more inclusive security architecture if we hadn't pursued the unilateral NATO approach. The third point on cooperation on sort of discrete threats, things like counterterrorism. Just this was a point you made, that we have very deep intel sharing relationships with NATO members. That's only been the case for the last few years. And if you actually look at some of the deepest cooperation that we have on intelligence, it's with the Five Eyes nations, a number of which aren't in NATO, and it owes a lot more to sort of historical ties with Anglophone countries than it does to NATO per se. And I guess, to the question about NATO as a vehicle for cooperation on these issues, I would argue that there is a downside to that too. Using NATO as our primary means of interaction with Europe necessarily pigeonholes the transatlantic relationship into a security relationship. And I would argue that today, the transatlantic relationship shouldn't primarily be about security. It should be about trade and democracy and diplomacy and all of those other things that are outside of the NATO framework, and that we might perhaps have more success in pursuing or be pushed to consider more thoroughly if we weren't focused so heavily on the security aspects of the relationship.
Great. Well, I'll open it up with a general question, one that has kind of come to my mind in preparing a bit for this debate. But it seems to me that we wouldn't even really be having this conversation if it weren't for Trump's kind of calling into question the value of the strategic relationship with NATO. So do you think the skepticism that Trump introduced to the American kind of conversation about grand strategy is here to stay? Or was it kind of a momentary thing? I know the Quincy Institute was founded in 2019 and is certainly promoting rethinking and reorganizing the assumptions of American foreign policy, NATO being certainly one of them. So how momentary is this NATO skeptic moment that we're in?
I'm happy to, if you have an order you'd like us to go in, let us know. Otherwise, I'm happy to take a first crack at it. So, Trump is one of a kind in a lot of respects, and it's hard to imagine a different American leader going about alliance relations in quite the same way that President Trump did, from unilaterally excising the sort of ritualistic affirmation of the Article 5 guarantee in his first trip to Brussels to, being very upset about how nice the building was and what that indicated about NATO's spending priorities and things like that. That said, it's not like this came entirely out of the blue. And so, as I said, NATO has faced some challenges for a number of years. And so one, the burden sharing challenge existed before Trump. In some ways, he was reacting to that. A second challenge that existed before that was simply that U.S. strategic focus isn't on Europe as a primary theater in the way that it was in the 1950s and 1960s anymore. And so obviously the United States has been trying intermittently to pivot to the Asia Pacific for about a decade. And so that was always going to pose some problems for an alliance that was still heavily centered on transatlantic and to some degree Middle East issues. I think what you're seeing now, though, is that NATO is undergoing its own rebalancing, which is probably healthy, to try to figure out exactly what its role is in this new era. And so NATO is still addressing the collective defense issues. And while there are some uncertainties there, I actually think the alliance has done a pretty good job since 2014 in terms of constructing at a reasonable cost a decent plan for defending its easternmost members if they are attacked, while at the same time trying to figure out how it can be useful on other issues. And so the Secretary General of Europe, of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has been talking about how NATO can position itself to be useful to the democratic community writ large in dealing with the Chinese challenge. So I think a lot of those discussions are going to continue because they're baked into kind of the strategic moment as opposed to being the particular province of any American leader. And I think that that's healthy. I think the alliance needs to evolve as strategic realities evolve.
So, I think that NATO is unique, right? Almost entirely unique in history in that it is an alliance which, when it outlived its security function, nonetheless persisted. And I think you can make a pretty good argument that that was because there was a sort of standing bureaucracy that had a vested interest in making sure that NATO persisted into the post-Cold War period. But what that means from my point of view is that you were always going to reach a point with NATO where the alliance's internal contradictions began to reveal themselves, where the problems of this alliance persisting past the point where its initial purpose was no longer existing, those problems were always eventually going to come to a head. And just to sort of make a slightly controversial statement, I'm actually not sure that John Mearsheimer's argument about NATO eventually collapsing is entirely wrong. I wonder if it may just take some time after the end of the Cold War for those contradictions to come to the fore. So the comments that I've made here tonight and my approach is coming from a place where I think NATO has value and I think it needs reform in order to avoid that collapse. And how this relates to Trump is that I think Trump, as he was in so many things, was a symptom, not a cause. Right? Trump was expressing a view that had become fairly widespread in public opinion, that was certainly felt in Washington. As Hal notes, previous administrations had been pushing on the burden sharing thing for a while. They hadn't been getting anywhere because they weren't really insisting. But there was certainly that view that Europe wasn't pulling its weight. And I think Trump, in his unique way, sort of smashed open the question of what we do with NATO going forward, didn't provide any answers because he never provided any answers to any foreign policy problem, but he's opened this window for debate on the future of NATO. And I think if we don't do something in this window to try and resolve those internal tensions, we will end up back in a place where someone else like Trump will come in and the organization will crumble because of it. So, from that point of view, I take Donald Trump to be as much as I say a symptom of what's going on with NATO and a warning of what will probably happen in the future if we don't address the institution's deficiencies.
So I'd like to extend Jasper's question from the kind of European perspective, because the past few years have seen the rise of a nationalist resurgence in Europe as well. Populists who reject what we might call the liberal world order, champion isolationism, lambast transnational organizations such as NATO. Descriptively, how do you think of this trend will affect the future of NATO from a European perspective? And normatively, what do you think the US should do about it?
You want to go first this time, Emma?
No, please go ahead.
Sure. So I think, look, there are political challenges, not just to NATO, but to the European project that has always been NATO's sort of continental counterpart. And I don't mean to deprecate the seriousness of those. I'll just make 2 points. One is that NATO has faced internal challenges before. And so NATO had at least one authoritarian member at the outset, right? It periodically had authoritarianism within the ranks during the Cold War, if there was a coup in Greece in the 1960s, or periodic Turkish coups and so on and so forth. But the balance of values in the alliance always remained democratic. And I think that's clearly the case today. And so, yes, there have been some troubling political currents within Europe, but the balance of values within the alliance remains pretty solidly democratic. And so I think that's worth keeping in mind. The second thing I would say is that it's useful to keep in historical perspective the challenges that NATO faces today. And so, yes, there are internal contradictions within the alliance. There are political challenges. There are geopolitical challenges. Of course, there have always been those challenges. And so if you were to ask, right now, are the problems that NATO faces, the crises that NATO faces, graver than Suez, right? Are they graver than the debate over the European defense community and German rearmament, or the Korean War in the early 1950s? Are they graver than when the French withdrew from the NATO military command and said, "Get every American soldier out of France," to which Dean Rusk famously replied, "Does that include the ones that are buried in the military graveyards?" Are they graver than during the Euro missiles crisis of the early 1980s? I'd say that the answer is probably no. And so that doesn't mean we should be complacent. I mean, I think Emma's point that we should address challenges that emerge within the alliance forthrightly and not pretend that they don't exist is critical. But we should do so bearing in mind that the alliance has gone through some incredibly difficult times in the past. It has always managed to come through it, in part because it is this enormously adaptable and resilient organization, in part because it is so deeply institutionalized, in part because its members see so much value in it that they don't want to see it fall apart. And so that should give us a reservoir of confidence that we actually can address these issues without having to, fundamentally reevaluate the American commitment to NATO or do things that might be even more drastic still.
Yeah, so I'll just make two comments, I guess. So the first is that I think I alluded to this in my earlier remarks, but I think the question of democracy matters less than the question of alignment, for lack of a better word. So I don't particularly think it's a problem. I agree with Hal here that there have always been authoritarian members within NATO. Sometimes we purposefully admitted them. Sometimes there was backsliding. And we kept them in for security reasons, right? We admitted Turkey to NATO because it was a valuable security partner and we needed it for the Cold War. I think where that runs into problems is not on the democracy angle, it's on the question of alignment. So when Hungary is actively pushing Russian policies, right, from within NATO, that's a problem. When Turkey is buying Russian weapons systems that can spy on our weapons systems, that's a problem. And so, we admitted these authoritarian states. We bent the democratic character of the alliance in order to shore up our strategic needs. But now we're in a situation where neither is the case, where we're undermining our strategic needs as well. And obviously, the alliance has no means for booting members out. And so this is a problem that is very difficult, perhaps impossible to solve within the existing structure. So again, I would suggest that we start thinking about ways in which maybe the alliance could think about booting members out if we want it to remain sort of strategically viable. And then I guess just a second point, I don't want to go too in depth on this, but I think popular will to defend alliance members is a problem across most of Europe. If you look at public polling that's done in most NATO member states, what you find is that the public is overwhelmingly not willing to defend allied states. And that's somewhat true in the US, somewhat true, I think, bare majorities in the US and the UK, sometimes France. But then when you get over to Germany and other states, the populations there say they're not even willing to defend other states in NATO. And I think this is the result of an alliance that has become so watered down with such an unclear purpose over time. And so I think, again, unless something is done to improve the structure and the approach of the alliance, that popular will is going to continue to slip away. And so I see some of these currents that are happening now as a reflection of the alliance being effectively rudderless for the last couple of decades.
Could I respond briefly? Because Emma said something that I wholeheartedly agree with, and so I wanna flag this because I think it's important. And this is the point of thinking creatively about how to deal, particularly with Hungary, which I think is the poster child for countries that are not just backsliding politically, but pursuing agendas that are at odds with NATO's strategic interests. And it's absolutely true that it's hard to deal with from an organizational perspective because NATO operates by consensus. And so any measure that's put forward to punish Hungary in a meaningful way can be vetoed by Hungary. But NATO also operates as an association of sovereign powers. And those sovereign powers can do things unilaterally to make clear their displeasure with wayward members of the alliance. And so if you could form a group within NATO of countries that agreed to suspend their bilateral participation in military exercises involving Hungary until certain conditions are met. The United States, if it wanted to, could even say the United States is reinterpreting its Article 5 defense commitment to Hungary because that is ultimately a bilateral commitment that the United States makes to Hungary, right? It's reflected in our political process and say, we think that this is void until these commitments are met. I don't know if the United States should be willing to go that far right now, but I think that the United States should certainly be willing to think more about ways of applying pressure unilaterally or as part of a coalition of the willing within NATO than it has been in dealing with Hungary in the past. And in fact, there's a precedent for this. And so the United States in the 1980s announced that it was suspending its alliance obligations to New Zealand over a dispute involving nuclear weapons in ports in New Zealand, basically. And so the United States said, look, we're simply not going to, we're going to consider this alliance a dead letter with respect to New Zealand until this issue is resolved. And so there actually is a precedent here. And I think that this is an area where we should be thinking creatively, precisely because what Hungary is doing is so damaging.
I want to follow up directly on that point. We have an audience member asking you, Dr. Ashford, about the types of reforms you'd like to see. I know you hinted at potentially creating a mechanism for removing a member state, or at least exploring the possibility. Is that a real political possibility for NATO to actually have that sort of expulsion device in the treaty? And do you agree with Dr. Brands' assessment of the kinds of reforms we need in terms of military exercises, or is more required to reform the alliance?
So I think Hal's response about sort of US bilateral commitments, I think, is really the only legal way to talk about suspending commitments to a NATO member state. There are somewhat more creative methods out there that have been suggested, ones that would talk about setting up subgroupings within NATO, within which countries would pool their defensive capabilities, and those countries within the groupings would be the first port of call in a crisis. So I heard somebody refer to it as the new Warsaw Pact at some point. So that's one of the more creative ways of thinking about this. And then there are ways of thinking about this again outside of the framework of NATO, but within the confines of US foreign policy. So we have seen, the Trump administration, for example, take the sanctions approach towards Turkey, and it seems like that's something the Biden administration may continue. So the US has foreign policy tools to bring countries back into line on some of these questions that may be useful. That said, I do think longer term, the plan probably has to be to think through these much more creative off-the-wall approaches to security, and in particular to just within the existing framework of NATO to dialing down the US commitment so that we are less directly impacted by some of these problems.
So we have an audience question on the following theme. How is NATO impacted by the economic dependence of European nations upon natural gas from Russia? How does this dependence kind of shape or prevents us from responding properly to potential Russian military aggression or the actions that are deemed destabilizing in the future?
I'll just say a couple of things about this. In the mid-2000s, round about the time of the 2006 and 2009 Ukraine gas crises, 2011 Belarus gas crisis, there was a lot of concern among European states that Russia might be able to strategically use cutoffs of gas to punish European states. That's not really the case anymore. In the first place, it was really only possible for smaller states and states that immediately bordered Russia, like Ukraine. In the second place, the thing that is often forgotten about those disputes is that they were in fact price disputes. Russia was not getting paid for its gas. And while that's not an excuse, it does explain why Russia was willing to cut off the gas. If you were to think more broadly about whether Russia is willing to cut off all its gas exports to Europe for political points, that would also mean Russia cutting off its revenue streams. Russia's economy is heavily dependent on the revenues from natural gas and oil. They don't really have the scope to engage in such a large use of their energy resources. So that's sort of another problem. And then the third problem with this is that since Since those crises in the mid-2000s, the European Union has actually undertaken a very active and very effective energy policy, which effectively basically built channels, mostly pipelines, between states to allow for gas to flow back from the members in Western Europe to the members in Eastern Europe in the case of a crisis. So effectively, Europe deepened the integration of its gas markets, which makes it far less vulnerable to shutoffs to any one specific country. So there have been concerns about particularly the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would carry Russian gas to Germany and bypass some of the transit countries that Russia might be most willing to use the gas weapon on. But it's actually far less of a concern than it was. 15 years ago, this might have been a major concern, but now with the European changes to their gas market integration, it's not as big of a problem as it used to be. And so I do not buy the sort of particularly the Trump administration line or the line that was in the CAATSA sanctions from a few years back that the US needs to stand up to Russian gas exports in Europe if it's to succeed with NATO.
Yeah, I would just briefly add that in general, I would like to see more European diversification away from Russian energy sources. In general, I would like to see Nord Stream 2 not come to completion. I think that the debate, as Emma indicated, is sort of how serious of an issue is this, and what level of pressure should the United States be willing to apply to try to bring about its desired outcome. And by the way, this is usually where the controversy in U.S.-European discussions over economic integration with the East, for lack of a better word, come into play. And so this actually mirrors in some ways a big debate that happened within NATO in the 1980s about the construction of, wouldn't you know it, an energy pipeline linking Siberia with Western Europe, which the American concern was that this was going to give the Soviets an ability to earn lots of hard currency and thereby fund military modernization and other nefarious things. And it turned into a huge blow up within the alliance because the United States applied sanctions not just on the pipeline and not just on the Soviet concerns that were involved, but on the Western European concerns that were involved as well in the middle of a pretty deep recession in Western Europe. And so there was a sort of a legendary comment from Margaret Thatcher saying that she felt that the UK had been deeply wounded by a friend as a result of this. And so what the United States ultimately discovered in that case was that it made more sense to basically accept half a loaf in terms of limiting East-West strategic trade as opposed to trying to kill the pipeline altogether. And I think that's sort of the similar debate that we're in today. We would prefer to have this thing not materialize, but exactly how much friction are we willing to engender within the transatlantic alliance to bring that outcome about is where the crux of the argument is.
If I could just add here just a fun fact, one of the main books about that pipeline crisis, Ally versus Ally, was written by none other than Tony Blinken, our current Secretary of State, so he is well aware of this history.
Great. I want to ask about another challenge to NATO, which both of you have alluded to, that being the relationship with Turkey. Yesterday, Jens Stoltenberg at a speech mentioned that Turkey still remains an important ally for NATO and is indeed sort of a critical point in the relationship. And he made the argument very much that NATO is geopolitically, it's geographically important to the alliance. Do you think this should be a serious concern for US policymakers who are wary of Turkish influence? I don't expect under the Biden admin to be more sympathetic to Turkey than Trump was, especially, given kind of the current political climate in the foreign policy community in the United States.
I'll just say something quickly in here. I mean, I don't claim to be a Turkey expert. I mean, I guess I'll say that there are serious concerns about the direction that Turkey has been moving over the course of about a decade now, not simply with respect to its internal politics, which have become more and more illiberal under Erdogan, but also aspects of its foreign policy, which have become less and less helpful to American interests on a variety of issues. I also think it's important to keep in mind that we shouldn't assume that Turkey necessarily has more leverage than it has in this relationship, because the game that Turkey plays in terms of both sort of flirting with the Russians, but also occasionally opposing the Russians and trying to play the United States and Russia off each other only works if NATO is backing Turkey up in this sort of thing. And so it wasn't actually that long ago, it was back in late 2015 that the Turks shot down a Russian jet that had come across the frontier from Syria. And there was for a few days, it looked like there was a very serious chance of some sort of diplomatic confrontation between the Russians and the Turks. That said, I think that Stoltenberg is right. And I think that, Turkey plays a very important role in the region. And also there will be Turkey after Erdogan. It's hard to envision right now, but I would like to see the door kept open to a relationship with a country that's quite important in a couple of different regions. And so this is a tough one. I think that, the United States and NATO certainly would prefer that Turkish policy and politics be going in a different direction. But the challenge is to find ways of signaling displeasure and exerting pressure, as the Trump administration did on the S-400 sale, as Emma mentioned, which I think was the right thing to do, without necessarily foreclosing the possibility of a more constructive relationship 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road.
Yeah, so I'm not a Turkey specialist either, though Turkey is one of my favorite places on earth. But I do sort of concur with a lot of what Hal said here. Turkey is deeply problematic for a number of reasons. The democracy angle is really only one of them, and perhaps not the major one. If anything, I probably would take a stronger line on the notion that Turkey's foreign policy in recent years has actually been quite damaging to US interests. Turkey invaded Syria while the US was engaged in fighting ISIS there. Turkey is engaged in genocide against Kurds living within its borders and without its borders. Turkey has engaged in serious hostilities with Russia. Again, as Hal notes, we had a Turkish plane shot down by Russians, just a few years back. And none of this is good for US interests or for US security or for European security more broadly. Turkey continues to effectively play footsie with the Russians. So sometimes they're friendly with Russia, sometimes they're friendly with NATO, and they sort of try to play both sides off against one another. But I do take issue with the notion that it's all fine because NATO isn't going to come riding to Turkey's aid anyway, which is effectively sort of, forgive me if I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it sort of sounds like that's what you were saying, is that it's okay because NATO isn't going to, it's only going to be a problem if NATO backs Turkey to the hilt in some of these conflicts. And I think that's a really dangerous assumption. I also don't think that if Turkey ended up getting in a shooting war with one of its neighbors, that we would necessarily leap to defend them. In any case, Article 5 doesn't apply in many cases when it comes to Turkey's borders. But I do think that it's fairly dangerous to assume that NATO won't get embroiled in some kind of conflict that Turkey starts or escalates. And as long as we have that defense tie, I think that's a concern. So Turkey is one of those few NATO members where I would absolutely advocate trying to find a way to get them out of the alliance if at all possible. And certainly in the meantime, to cut them off from military support and arms sales.
So let me just say one thing on this, just in response to I think it was the second to last point that Emma made, which is, NATO, because it's a collection of sovereign countries, actually has an enormous amount of latitude in picking which of its members' fights it wants to get involved in and which of its members' fights it does not want to get involved in. And there's actually precedent for this with Turkey. And so Turkey and Greece have nearly come to blows at various points during the post-war era, actually did at one point in the 1970s in a crisis over Cyprus. And the United States basically said, look, go figure it out, right? This is not a fight that we're going to come into on either side of that one. And there's a similar latitude to do that today. And so I think if the question is, should the United States be pushing Turkey out of NATO, I would not want to go that far, because I would want to maintain the possibility of hedging for a post-Erdogan leadership, while recognizing that that's not going to solve all of the problems in the relationship. But I think along the way, we have a little bit more latitude, because as is the case in every alliance relationship the United States has, there are various loopholes, there are various carve-outs, there are things we insert into the critical articles of the alliance that give us escape hatches if we need to find ways of not embroiling ourselves in, say, a dumb conflict that one of our allies starts.
So a number of audience members have asked about China, and so I'm going to try to synthesize all these questions at once. NATO was originally created during the Cold War, and some now talk of a new Cold War with China. Yet it seems like Europe is reluctant to be as hawkish on the CCP as the US is. What do you think of Europe's approach to Sino-European relations? Should the US be more aggressive in asking the EU to restrain Chinese influence? And more specifically, how do you think NATO can balance commitments to the United States, given Chinese infrastructure pouring into Europe, especially in transportation, energy infrastructure, and especially with the kind of recent installation of the peace cable linking data traffic between China and Europe?
So, I mean, so obviously, first of all, the technical point, which is that NATO does not apply outside the Euro-Atlantic area, and so technically doesn't apply when we're talking about China. But in practical terms, that's not actually true. We've seen NATO allies send submarines to patrol in the Pacific. There's pressure in Washington on European states to get tougher on some issues, and I guess I would draw a line between sort of two discrete phenomena. So one is the case of areas where the US has legitimate defense concerns about what European states are doing. So this is where we start to talk about things like Huawei and ZTE, their access to telecoms networks in Europe. If the US hopes to provide an alternative to Chinese 5G networks, for example, the technology is going to have to come out of Scandinavia, it's going to have to come out of Europe. And so there are places where European states and connections to China could actually be seriously detrimental for US security if it provides backdoors into our networks. And so that's an area where I think we do have to be quite careful, and we do have to be sort of pushing back sometimes. However, I also think that there are areas where the exact opposite is true. And from that point of view, I actually welcome the skepticism from a lot of European countries about Washington's sort of wholehearted turn towards China as the new great power threat that we suddenly have to deal with, a concept that has really only become widespread in the last 4 or 5 years. Before that, there was a lot more talk about China as emerging into the liberal order and being a responsible partner. And so this is a very new turn in Washington. And I appreciate that a lot of European states are very hesitant to follow the US down what they see as quite a militaristic turn towards China. And so to the extent that there are differences between European capitals and Washington on the question of China, I actually think it's where Washington has to listen more to those in Europe that are expressing skepticism about some of the steps that we are taking very fast, even before we're entirely sure what Chinese intentions are.
So I'll say one thing in agreement, which is that one of the real values of the transatlantic relationship is that it exposes us to countries that aren't afraid to tell us that we're wrong when we're wrong on things. And having this sort of second opinion function of the alliance is actually very useful when you find the United States involved in military conflicts, for instance, that the vast majority of its NATO allies stay out of. Those military conflicts tend not to end that well for the United States. On the issue of China, I think NATO as an institution may be less important here than the decisions that particular European states make. And perhaps the United States can use its influence in with NATO to influence those decisions. But when we think about sort of how the United States needs to partner with Europe in dealing with China, it's less about sort of a collective defense function than it is about economic choices and technological choices and what individual European states, the ones that still have some global power projection capability, might do in, say, a Taiwan crisis or a South China Sea crisis. And I would say, when we look at sort of how fully Europe is aligning with the United States on these issues, it's clearly not where a lot of American policymakers would like it to be. And if you want an indication of that, there was just the EU-China investment deal that was signed just before Joe Biden comes into office, sort of over the objections of the incoming team that had put the idea of cooperating with Europe on China at the forefront of its foreign policy. And you've had Macron and Merkel give statements since then saying that they're not going to be drawn into a policy of blocks vis-a-vis China. The only thing I would say here is that pay attention to the function more than the form of this. And so, Germany and France both declined to explicitly ban Huawei from their 5G systems, but they structured the decision in a way that makes it very, very difficult actually for Huawei to participate in the construction of those systems. They've talked about not being part of a policy of blocks, but France and the United Kingdom are contributing naval assets to presence missions and thinking about contingencies in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait in a way that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. And so there actually has been a fair amount of progress on this compared to, say, 2015, 2016, even 2018. I anticipate it's going to be sort of a slow teeth-pulling process in the way that things often are within the transatlantic relationship. But I'm actually fairly sanguine about the fact that Europe is going to align with the United States far more than with China over the long term in this Sino-American competition.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight, but I want to thank both of you for engaging in this really insightful conversation. I know I really enjoyed it. I know Matisse enjoyed it, and I know we had a really great audience tonight. So thank you both for coming, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks. Good night.